Arianna Simpson joins us today from San Francisco. She's a general partner at Andreessen Horowitz, a multi-stage venture firm investing across seed through growth. a16z crypto has raised more than $7.6 billion across 4 funds, and the most recent was $4.5 billion in 2022. Prior to Andreessen, Arianna was the founder of Autonomous Partners, an investment fund focused on crypto and digital assets. She has invested in notable companies, including Mistin Labs, Phantom, Blackbird, and Talos. Arianna, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you. Can you just quickly walk through your background and your path to becoming a VC?
Sure. I kind of fell down this journey a little bit by accident. I initially became interested in crypto following a trip I took around Southern Africa. I ended up in Zimbabwe, and when I was there, I saw kind of the aftermath of the really dramatic hyperinflation that they'd experienced following kind of reckless printing of money by their president/dictator, Robert Mugabe. And when I came back to the U.S., I was discussing what I'd seen with a friend of mine who was kind of an early Princeton math and computer science guy. And he was telling me about how, Bitcoin was sort of, in a way, the opposite of you could never have that sort of hyperinflation with Bitcoin because there was a fixed supply. And I had never heard of Bitcoin at the time. This was 2012 or early 2013. But I was very curious. And so I started reading the Bitcoin white paper, and that was kind of my aha moment. A few months of reading and research later, I was pretty hooked. And so I decided I wanted to move into the industry full time. And that kind of led me down the investing journey, initially just kind of on my own, and then helped launch a fund and then launched a second fund on my own. Again, exclusively focused on crypto, the latter, and then joined Andreessen almost 6 years ago.
Amazing. So you read the white paper. Have they figured out who Satoshi is at this point?
Well, rumors abound, as always. Nobody knows for sure, or at least most people don't know for sure. But I think that actually kind of adds to the mysticism. I think in a way, Bitcoin in particular has become a bit of a religion, and having that sort of lack of specificity about the origin story, I think, is actually very valuable in a way. And certainly adds to kind of the lore of the asset.
100%. Well, good. Can you give us kind of an overview of your thesis?
Yeah, so I would say that at the firm, our thesis is kind of always evolving. Looking back a few years, we had a thesis around the importance of layer 1 blockchains and the role that different blockchains were going to play in kind of building out the ecosystem. I think that thesis largely kind of came to fruition. And over the last few years, we've thought about kind of the next generation of crypto as the third generation of the internet. So you kind of had the first wave of the web, which was really centered around open source technologies and, had a lot of good principles and ethos behind it, but was not great on the usability front. A lot of, you kind of had to be a tech nerd early on in order to use the early internet. And then we had kind of the modern consumer internet as we know it, which was a lot more user friendly, but really wasn't, basically involved a lot of walled gardens and didn't necessarily always have the best interests of the users in mind, because a lot of companies were sort of profiting off users' data and things like that without really giving much back to the user. And so our kind of high-level thesis is that crypto brings the third generation of the internet, where you kind of combine the usability of the modern consumer internet, but with the open source ethos of the first generation of the internet. Now, of course, within crypto is a broad space, and there's a lot of different subcategories that we think a lot about. I would say I'm currently very much in the form of, or in the place of thinking through my stablecoin thesis, because I think obviously that is a huge category that has really emerged over the last few, call it 18 months. It's a category that we've thought a lot about for a number of years, but really couldn't reach mass scale until more recently, because we weren't, in a place where we had cheap enough or fast enough transactions to be supported or to support a kind of massive scale industry until more recently. And so now I think we're very much in the thick of forming our precise thesis on that category. Mm-hmm. What I'll say for now is it's really exciting to see a subsector of crypto that is being used for real world use cases, payments across the globe, bringing down costs dramatically for people who need to move money internationally or even within the confines of their own country. And so I think that's also spurring a lot of other use cases of crypto that are kind of adjacent to stablecoins. So I'm personally spending a lot of time thinking about that at the moment.
What would you say has been the unlock that has allowed stablecoins to rise the way that they have and become kind of the hot topic of the moment?
Yeah, I think it's really primarily an infrastructure issue because, while people were saying, oh, crypto is great for international money movement, it really wasn't great until you could bring the cost down dramatically. So if you look back a few years, in high traffic moments, you could be spending $10 to send $100 on Ethereum, which obviously is not practical. That's in no way better than the existing system. In many ways, it's worse. So until we were able to make throughput rapidly available and cheaply available, it just didn't make sense. But now we've reached a point where the infrastructure is good enough, it's fast enough, it's cheap enough that we can really see these, blockchains used for this kind of use case. And I think it's really taking the world by storm. I mean, I'm, often in the room with traditional financial institutions and they're using stablecoin transfers on a daily basis, which is pretty incredible considering a few years ago that would have been like a non-starter.
I mean, that is the definition of disruption, right? When the cost side of the equation drops to a level that it can be adopted in an unprecedented way, that's when things tend to explode. What was the technology unlock there that makes those transactions much more cost efficient, versus the very expensive sort of traditional Ethereum, Bitcoin transactions?
Well, it was really a combination of improving scalability in existing blockchains and also adding new chains. And that was generally, for example, through the explosion of new layer 2s, in some cases even layer 3s, that are kind of building one level above the base chains like L1s, I say layer 1s, which are things like Ethereum or Solana. And then you have things like Optimism or Arbitrum or others that are building one layer above in the stack. And so it's really kind of a combination of scaling improvements in some of the existing layer 1 blockchains and adding more and more blockchains that are kind of sitting one tier above.
And, I feel like reserve asset risk and liquidity mismatch risk may be underestimated at the moment when it comes to stablecoins. Somebody exchanges their currency for a stablecoin, right? Like the stablecoin company has to then either create a reserve, right? Or as they're pegging that and they're exposed to potential runs. What do you think about those risk centers for stablecoins and how they can be mitigated?
Well, in many cases, the stablecoins are backed one-to-one, so that risk is really basically non-existent. Obviously there's a lot of attention on the regulation surrounding stablecoins. Mm-hmm. Obviously, the Genius Bill, which was passed earlier this year, was a big step in the right direction there. So I think in a similar way that these kinds of things are regulated for the traditional banking industry, we're going to see, continued attention there. So in general, I think the risks of that, systemically are pretty low at this point.
How do we deal with geopolitical risk, right? As stablecoins scale across borders and become kind of this global payments layer?
Can you say more about what you mean by that?
Yeah, so in a lot of respects, stable coins are becoming a standard that many are relying on. But there's geopolitical uncertainty. There are countries that may adopt policy that prevents transactions. Is that a challenge for some of these stablecoin companies to overcome?
It may become so in the future. I would say at the moment, a lot of the, it sort of depends. Yes, like if a Chinese company were to become the number one issuer of global stablecoins, then that might open the door to certain kinds of risks, just because if it was controlled, for example, by either the Chinese government or a Chinese company, which is therefore also kind of potentially controlled by the Chinese government, then that might, open the door for some risks, because they might be able to kind of affect the issuance or other things related to the stablecoin that might cause issues. Currently, I don't see that as a big risk, but it's something to kind of keep an eye on.
What is the biggest bull case on stablecoins moving forward?
Probably that they become, the number one way of moving any kind of money digitally. I think it's very likely that that's the direction that we're trending in. I think over time, the costs, which are already extremely low, are going to continue to trend down, which, depending who you are, is a good or bad thing. Obviously, if you're somebody who makes money by, shaving a few basis points off transactions, then that is a less good thing for you. Although hopefully you end up making it up in volume, because you're doing such dramatic volumes that even a tiny, tiny sliver of the money that you're moving is a huge amount of money over time. But it ends up being generally very good things for consumers or businesses who need to move money internationally, because obviously they're able to do so in a way that's cheaper, faster, and, more, faster and not limited by banking hours. Because obviously if you're able to send money and have it arrive a few minutes later, or even a few seconds later eventually, then that's a very attractive proposition. If you're sending an international wire, sometimes it can take a week, which feels crazy in this day and age. So I think seeing the better part of all global money movements happening in stablecoins is kind of a big part of the bull case. Now, of course, that also means that there will be all sorts of other financial products that will be kind of built on that infrastructure. But I think of kind of that as the epicenter of that bull case.
Great. We jumped right into stablecoins, but I'd love to zoom out to crypto, at a higher level, higher altitude for a minute. Crypto's had at least a decade now to kind of find product market fit. There's been a lot of false starts. I mean, I've been hosting this show for, 12 years or so, and we've had a lot of folks that were bearish on Bitcoin, but bullish on blockchain and a variety of things, over time, NFTs, metaverse, et cetera, Web3. Today, what would you say are the 2 or 3 use cases where it's clearly the best tech tool? And what are maybe some of the hyped up predictions that have conclusively failed to find real sustained utility?
Sure. Obviously stablecoins, I would say, is the number one that's really working and has a lot of utility that's not related to anything speculative. I think crypto is sort of demonstrating itself as a new version of the financial system. And I think that's very interesting because over the years, many investors, ourselves included, have kind of looked for other use cases. And I think at least at this moment in time, it's really looking like the new financial rails is the path forward. Now, that doesn't mean there won't be other things kind of built on crypto rails in the future, but I think in terms of what's working now, that's really where we're seeing the majority of the activity. And, that's a huge use case. I think it's easy to be like, oh, well, is it just for finance? And it's like, no, probably not if we're looking at like a 10 or 20 year horizon. But in the near term, that's probably where we're going to see the most adoption. And I think that kind of forks off in a lot of different directions. Obviously, we've seen kind of the rise of prediction markets as another category that's very interesting, and also has a financial basis, but is kind of fundamentally different in nature than something like stablecoins. But yeah, I think obviously this is generally happening outside of the US due to regulation here, but also the rise of things like perps markets and things like that, other forms of trading, which have kind of taken off like crazy in the last few, again, call it 12 to 18 months. All of those, I think, are indicative of the fact that in its current phase, crypto is really a broadly financial tool, which takes many different forms in many of these different subcategories. Yeah, I think there are other more nascent exploratory categories that are very interesting but have yet to kind of be developed, which are, things like the intersection of crypto and AI. And again, like even there's generally a financial underpinning. And so, for example, to give a concrete scenario in which the two converge, obviously now the large AI companies are very data hungry. They're kind of in many cases concerned that they're running out of new data. And one thing that crypto is very good at is incentivizing people to perform some sort of action through financial rewards. And so we're seeing companies built around this idea of, okay, let's use crypto incentives either by paying folks in stablecoins or in our own native token to get them to go and collect novel forms of data. So, for example, that could be wearing a GoPro on your head while you wash dishes and selling those to AI companies that are building robotic agents, physical agents who will actually do physical tasks like that. And the interesting thing there is that if you have a high quality data set, it's pretty much certain that you can sell it. There's really no question on the demand side. And so that makes it a very interesting market to pursue. So, again, there's crypto is playing a financial role here. It's also a role of kind of incentives. And categories like that are starting to emerge, but obviously they're still quite early.
And as you talk about the convergence of AI and crypto, you gave us a good consumer example of data collection. What are the sort of overhyped, underhyped areas between the convergence of the two?
Something I think is still underhyped, unless you're kind of in certain pretty niche circles, is the intersection. Well, I'm kind of going to give you an answer that is in a way both overhyped and underhyped, in the sense that obviously there's a lot of talk of stablecoins, a lot of talk of AI, a lot of talk of agentic payments, or maybe not in the general public, but at least in my circles. And I think, people are throwing out all these buzzwords, but what those actually mean in practical terms is still a little bit amorphous. I think we're going to figure it out in the next, call it 2 to 3 years. And what's interesting to me is the fact that, we basically built the internet for people and actually historically have gone to great lengths to avoid bots. We didn't want bots. Everything is, anti-bot. Why do you have to enter? Why do you have to fill out CAPTCHAs and things like that? It's all to avoid bots, which is what agents fundamentally are, from using the internet. And I think now we're going to see kind of a pretty dramatic reversal of that, where actually the bots are doing the majority of the crawling of the internet, and you as a user are maybe interacting with a single interface like a ChatGPT or something like that. So while all those words that I mentioned are kind of floating around and overhyped in a way, it's actually still very unclear exactly what the new version of the internet is going to look like and how agents are actually going to be interacting with what have historically been websites designed for people. Because obviously, if you're designing something for an agent, the optimal design is going to look quite different than if you're designing it for a person. And so I think while there's a lot of discussion of these terms, there's very little specificity around what the kind of new versions are going to be and what is going to need to be re-architected in order to kind of serve the new needs of users, which, of agents on the behalf of users, really.
I mean, it's a really interesting point, the bots and the agents, because we're seeing kind of the business model for the internet changing before our eyes. I think Sam Altman mentioned a few days ago they're introducing advertising on OpenAI. And I was doing some Claude analysis earlier today, and I reached my token limit. And, it's just interesting to think about the business model of the internet and, incentivizing or creating payments based on the number of calls and the amount of processing that's being done, which is kind of a re-architecture of the way that monetization works today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And, in the same way that there were business models that were entirely new and internet native that had never existed before, things like affiliate models and things like that, that didn't make sense pre-internet. There's going to be new business models that have to be designed around this kind of new agentic future. And, I think very likely stablecoins will be one of the primary methods of payment for that, because it's a lot easier to give your agent a wallet with some stablecoins and parameters around how they can spend it, rather than trying to give them your credit card, which is specifically designed to not allow for non-human usage.
Let's talk about the investing side a bit. So tokens remain a somewhat controversial investment vehicle in venture. Do you invest in tokens, in equity, or both?
Yeah, we invest in both. We've been longtime token investors, and tokens have done very well for us in general. I think the reason for that is because they are the critical atomic unit of a crypto network. And so if you are not investing, well, first of all, a token is required to make a real crypto network work, because if you don't have any value at stake, there's no reason for the participants of the network to remain honest. And so a token network without a token is really just a database. So if you don't have a token, investing in much of the space doesn't really make much sense. I would say, however, that some crypto adjacent companies will never have a token, and that is fine, because they need to be more centralized, in which case, for both regulatory reasons and other reasons, it doesn't make sense for them to have a token. In those cases, we invest in equity, and that's perfectly fine. We are certainly open to both. But I think I personally would find it very challenging to invest in the space and not be able to invest in tokens. And fortunately, the firm has kind of had a long time view that tokens were a critical way of participating in the space and owning a piece of a network. And therefore, we've been doing investments in token form for a long time as well.
Are ICOs back now, Arianna? And if so, what are the token launch practices that should be retired? Because there has been some bad behavior, and the converse of that, what are the best practices if somebody is launching a token?
Yeah, I'm not sure we really want them to come back, or at least not in their original form. Look, I think the challenge is that is largely a regulatory challenge, because ultimately, a lot of the ICOs that came around the first time weren't really did not always do things by the book. Let's put it that way. So I'm hopeful that, we can get to a place where people are able to build their networks in a way that is compliant. And I think, the industry is very much looking forward to hopefully a piece of legislation being passed in the next, let's call it 6 months, which would really help delineate what is allowed, how tokens are classified, what the path to progressive decentralization looks like for people to be able to legally launch tokens in the United States. So all of these kind of topics are very much being discussed in DC. And, the current administration is very much friendlier than what we've seen in the past towards the industry. And so on the whole, I'm hopeful that we can get to a good place. But yeah, some of the tactics of past ICOs should remain indeed in the past.
I mean, should traditional venture and just traditional tech companies, non-crypto, be adopting some of these innovative techniques when it comes to selling equity? Selling something that's more liquid, something that's more transactable instead of just the traditional model?
Well, I think as always, there are pros and cons to everything. I do think it's likely that over the coming years, we see an increasing trend of tokenizing equity. An important thing to remember is that, if you have equity in a company that's not valuable, just by tokenizing it, you don't really get anything.
Sure.
So, you can't say, oh, here's an asset that nobody wanted. Now let's put it on a blockchain and voila. Obviously, that doesn't really work. So I think you have to kind of keep that in mind. And there are other considerations as well. For example, the fact that companies generally launch a token a lot sooner than companies go public also has its pros and cons. In some ways, that can be positive because employees and investors and others can get earlier liquidity, maybe after a few years, as opposed to 12 years like they might get if they're waiting for a company to IPO. But at the same time, that also has challenges for the company itself. I certainly don't think that it's a panacea. We shouldn't be, moving everything without regard for we shouldn't use, let's put everything on a blockchain, let's tokenize everything as kind of the magic bullet solution to everything. I think as all technologies, these are valuable tools that can be really beneficial in the right circumstances, but can also have trade-offs. That's true of any technology. And so I think, as always, we need to kind of consider that there are pros and cons and weigh those accordingly for each specific situation.
So I'm not a crypto investor, and I don't really have a view on where we're at in the cycle. I'd be curious to hear where you think we're at and what inning, so to speak, you think we're in. But what I have noticed is a lot of the pitches that I have seen, because I do look at some crypto pitches, it's technology and solutions that I've seen before. Like they're recreating some existing blockchain solutions, that have been done in the past. And of course, we have famous tech examples like Google was the 19th search engine. So being first to market doesn't mean you're going to be the winner. But, how do you find signal, when you're looking at a technology that's been done before? And what's a clear sign to you that a project is genuinely differentiated from previous efforts?
Well, oftentimes we're investing quite early. And so I look very much to the founders. That's kind of where I focus my attention personally. Obviously, there are many different styles of investing, and where I tend to focus is really finding the best teams. I think, we're fairly open-minded in terms of which categories to invest in, because as an investor, it's very difficult to fully predict the future and know which categories are actually going to be successful. But what is a bit easier, or at least more, you can build more of a practice around, is finding the best teams. And the reality is, in this business, you are only as good as the entrepreneurs are, because they're the ones who are really doing the hard work and really building the industry. And so your job is primarily to just find the best entrepreneurs and then help them be successful. So in many cases, we are investing before the tech has been fully built, or in some cases built at all. And so our focus is really investing in the people. Now, of course, you can go really deep, and we have many engineers and many very technical folks on our team who help us diligence both technology in the cases where it has been built, and also the founding teams to understand sort of why they're thinking of making certain architectural choices or things like that. So obviously we do go deeply in the weeds of kind of whatever there is. But in some cases we've invested, when literally it was like 2 guys in a pitch deck. So in those cases, we're kind of just assessing them. So yeah, I would say we're looking for a pattern of excellence, and that can manifest in many different ways. It could be having gone to a great school, having worked on a really high-performing team. It could be being in a very prestigious unit in a cyber security military environment. It could be having built a very well-known or well-respected open source project. So whatever that could mean is just generally this person has produced top tier work in the various environments that they've been in before. Also look for depth in terms of how extensively they have explored the idea maze. So how deeply do they understand their industry? Do they have great answers, even in cases where they're not sure of something yet, but they have a really solid pattern of thinking and a process for coming to the right conclusions? Are they somebody who other great talent is impressed by and wants to work for? So do we think they'll be successful in recruiting other great people to join their team? So there's kind of all these different things that often help us arrive at a decision. Returning to your earlier question of kind of where we are in the cycle, obviously that's very difficult to forecast from a financial perspective, and so that's not really what we focus
Arianna,
on.
Get out your crystal ball. Tell us all the answers.
No. Unfortunately, our GC will have my head. But I think what I can say that's different and interesting about this cycle is that so far, a lot of I would say the vast majority of the energy has really been coming from the institutional side. And that has been kind of a departure from past cycles, which were really driven by primarily retail energy. We're seeing a huge amount of interest and uptake from financial institutions of all different kinds. And retail participation in the market has been much more limited. It has always gotten to the point in past cycles where every taxi that you get in, the driver is like telling you about the crypto asset that they bought, or, my cousin's friend is texting me for token recommendations or things like that. And none of that has really transpired, or certainly nowhere near the levels that we've seen in the past. I think, that's potentially a good thing in that the market feels a bit more sober. But I do think that may also, just be a function of kind of where we are in that process. But, we've been talking about institutional adoption and the entrance of these more traditional financial players into the space for many years now. And it's exciting to see that it's actually happening now in a much more robust way than it was in the past. Previously, there were, many pilots, and like some of these activities were limited to the innovation group within a financial institution, but very little was actually being used like in production. And now we're seeing that shift. So overall, I think that's, very much a positive sign for the long-term presence, robustness, and seriousness of the industry.
Does compute become more of a constraint as AI data centers compete for chips and infrastructure?
I think there will be, I think that will be true, but only for a time. I mean, historically, whenever there was kind of a scarce digital resource in the history of technology, you see a period where it's not readily available, and then over the course of a few years, typically 5, the costs come down dramatically. Yep. And then you have a glut of it, which typically then leads to other forms of innovation, because people are like, oh, well, now that computer's really cheap, like we can do all these different things with it that weren't really possible before, or at least not at scale. And I mean, even in crypto, like what we were saying earlier about stablecoins now being able to take off because throughput on blockchains is readily available and is very cheap. What happens? Then you see people using stablecoins for payments in a way that they just weren't before. So I think, yes, there will probably be a crunch in the next couple of years, but after that, I think it's going to be an entirely solved problem, and we'll never think about it again. And it will seem crazy that there was ever even a time when this was a concern.
You know, Arianna, as you look across companies like Miston Labs, Phantom, Blackbird, Talos, you know, each in very different parts of the ecosystem, are there any patterns or insights that have emerged that kind of change the way that you evaluate new investments?
That's a very good question. I'm kind of in the process of a thorough review of my own portfolio recently, and I've been thinking a lot about this question. So, yes, I would say that, again, returning to the topic of the founders, I think founders who are incredibly deep into whatever it is that they're building is a necessary but not sufficient ingredient for success. And what I mean by that is of the companies in my portfolio and also our portfolio as a team where we've seen the most success, they tend to be ones where the founders deeply, deeply understand their industry to a, level of specificity that is actually really hard to find. And that seems like kind of an obvious, take, but you'd be surprised how many folks, particularly in an industry like crypto, which can kind of attract different waves of people in response to sort of the financial hype cycles, finding founders who really, really deeply understand what they're building and the constraints and problems and opportunities of their specific sub-industry is critical. So to give you an example that is concrete, I first met the Talos founders when, again, they were, as I said, two guys in a pitch deck. They hadn't built anything yet. But the two of them had they were both technical, both had impressive academic credentials, and then had worked together at a company called Broadway Technologies, which basically built financial infrastructure for the traditional financial market. So they had worked there for many years together, so they knew each other very well. And then basically came and said, we want to build a similar financial and technical stack for crypto. So here you have two guys, obviously incredibly smart, deeply technical, understand the rails of what they actually intend to build, and are basically taking the playbook that they saw in action at Broadway Technologies and bringing it to the traditional basically wanting to create connectivity between the traditional financial institutions and this new crypto market. Now, that's also a category in which having a deep understanding of traditional financial markets was critical. And that's not going to be true of all kinds of crypto founders. For example, if you're building an NFT marketplace, you don't need to understand anything about the traditional financial market. That might be more of a hindrance than anything else. But if you're going to be selling into the biggest financial institutions in the world, you better believe that you're going to need to understand what these people care about. How do you do testing? Like, you can't have a product like that and have it fall over. You need to have perfect reliability. You need to have top engineers who understand how to build these things. Anton, the CEO, had also spent time at AQR, where he had built very technical systems in a hedge fund context. So again, founders who have kind of the right DNA for that and have thought really deeply about the problem set. I think the version of that applies to each of the different scenarios is what I look for. So in the case of Blackbird, Ben Leventhal has been an entrepreneur focused on restaurant tech for his entire career. He started a food and nightlife blog called Eater in New York in the early 2000s. Then he created Resy, which he sold to American Express a number of years ago. And Blackbird is his third act, in which he kind of takes the benefits of a blockchain and brings them to help solve some of the issues that he's seen in the traditional restaurant tech market. So, for example, some of the big platforms like DoorDash and things like that are useful to restaurants, but they can also be kind of extractive because ultimately they kind of set the rules. The restaurants have very slim margins and they're having to give a big chunk of those away to the apps, but also have to kind of tolerate it in order to survive. And so, you see kind of the points of friction there. So Blackbird is kind of turning that model on its head and actually giving ownership in the network to the diners, people like me and you who go out to eat, and then also to the restaurants. And again, he's
what does that mean, bringing ownership to the restaurants and the diners?
So basically, as you go out to eat, if you're a consumer, as you pay using Blackbird, you earn tokens, and those give you. The model's a little complicated, but basically there are two different tokens. One is the equivalent of an airline mile, call it. And that you can spend. That is called Fly, and you can spend it. Exactly. And then there's another token which actually confers ownership into the network. And that is, you don't spend it in the same way, but that gives you an actual stake in the Blackbird network. And that is... the token basically is kind of conferring ownership to both users and restaurants in the network. So, again, returning to the point here, I think is that finding entrepreneurs who have that level of depth and obsession with their particular subcategory is like the key unlock. Now, obviously, there are markets that are better than others. So, you certainly need to overlay a great market together with a great founder. Unfortunately, if the market is bad and the founder is great, they may have an okay outcome, but they probably won't have a great one. But if you can find the marriage of a great set of entrepreneurs and a great market, then that's where the real magic happens.
You had mentioned NFTs. What's the future for NFTs?
I think they're a little bit on hiatus. And what I mean by that is I think they will come back. It may take a while, and I think they may be used in very different forms than what the initial, market looked like. It may not have anything to do with digital art. It may have entirely different utility, but I think it's a very interesting and useful concept. So I think we're just sort of in a space between different cycles. And I think eventually somebody else will come up with a use case that will seem obvious in retrospect because many of the best ideas do. But yeah, so I think they're dormant, but certainly not gone forever.
Arianna, if we could feature anyone here on the show, who do you think we should interview and what topic would you like to hear them speak about?
Well, I think to mention one of my founders, Anton from Talos would be great. I think so many founders are interested in how, as a young startup, you can start selling into, big companies, whether they're financial institutions or anybody else. And they've done a phenomenal job of that over a relatively short amount of time. So I think there would be a lot to learn from them on that topic.
Perfect. What book, article, or video would you recommend to listeners?
I'm reading a very interesting book called The Maniac about John von Neumann, which I think is it's very original in that it's kind of like a novel, but it's very much based in history. It's beautifully written and interesting for anyone who is curious about, a pillar of the history of technology and computers in particular.
Cool. Two more quick ones to wrap up. Do you have any habits or behaviors that are a secret weapon?
Sleep and exercise sound super basic, but I sleep a lot. thankfully I'm able to do so. I know a lot of people wish they could sleep better, but I've got the 8 sleep and the whole stack. Yeah, I think exercise is critical for my ability to function. I think it keeps me energetic and clear-headed. So highly recommend everyone figure out whatever kind of exercise they like doing and find a way to stick to it.
Perfect. And finally here, what's the best way for listeners to connect with you and follow along with Andreessen?
Probably Twitter. So we have a a16z crypto specific handle on X. I always forget it's called X now. And then myself, I'm also on Twitter at Arianna Simpson.
All right. She is Arianna Simpson. The firm is Andreessen Horowitz. Welcome to the new cycle of crypto. I hope you're ready for it. And Arianna, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.